I think they're living and then growing up in a world where it's much more talked about than when we were growing up.
It happened on Christmas Eve inside Sandringham, behind closed palace doors. The royal family was laughing, exchanging gifts, when Princess Charlotte stopped everything. Just 9 years old, she walked straight up to Prince William and said, one thing no one expected. Not in anger, not for attention, just truth. I miss you, as my dad. The room fell silent. Kate froze. William's face changed. The future King of England speechless. No cameras, no headlines. Just one raw, unfiltered moment that cracked the royal armor wide open. And what happened after that? Quietly shook the crown to its core. But this was only the beginning. What followed next would quietly reshape the way William saw his role as both a father and a future king. Something inside Prince William began to change, and everyone close to him noticed. It wasn't loud, it didn't happen overnight. But it was there in the way he paused longer before leaving a room, in the way his hand lingered just a second longer on his daughter's shoulder, in the way his laughter sounded less rehearsed and more real. He had always been present, physically at least. The photos were there, the appearances, the fatherly smiles for the press. But this was different. This was presence that couldn't be captured in photographs. It was emotional, it was honest, and it was new. After Charlotte's quiet confession, something shifted in William's world. That single sentence, spoken in the innocence of childhood, cracked through the armor he'd built over decades of duty. For years, he'd lived under the weight of a crown that wasn't yet his, but already pressing down. Meetings, appearances, diplomatic speeches, charitable commitments. His schedule ran his life. And somewhere in that blur of obligation, he'd become a man divided, a public figure admired for his composure, but slowly drifting from the very people he loved most. And Charlotte, bold, fearless, unfiltered Charlotte, had been the one to say it out loud. In the days that followed, there was no grand gesture, no media announcement, no family statement. But those closest to William could feel it. The change was subtle, but undeniable. He looked his children in the eyes more often. He asked questions and waited for the answers. He didn't just hug them, he held on. When they laughed, he laughed too, but not out of politeness. He was really there, really with them. And Kate? She saw it first, in the way William knelt down to tie Louis's shoes instead of calling for help. In how he started reading stories again at bedtime, uninterrupted by his phone. Her pride in Charlotte deepened, not just because of what her daughter had said, but because of what it had sparked. William began making space in places where there had only been pressure. He cut back on late-night planning sessions. He showed up for small things, a school recital, a morning breakfast, a walk in the garden. These were not headline moments, but they mattered. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't rushing through his role. He was living it. Fully. Presently. The castle walls around him were still there, but they no longer stood between him and his children. They were now just walls, not barriers. And though Charlotte never brought up her message again, she didn't have to. Its echo lingered in every moment that followed. It had done what no royal protocol could. It reminded a father who he truly was. And to truly understand how a child could deliver such a powerful wake-up call, we need to go back to where it all began. The birth of a uniquely aware royal. From her very first breath, the world was watching Princess Charlotte. But her heart was quietly being shaped, far from the cameras. May 2nd, 2015, wasn't just the day a child was born, it was the arrival of a name that carried 3 generations of royal legacy. Charlotte Elizabeth Diana. A name that whispered of her grandfather Charles, paid homage to the reigning monarch, and stirred the memory of a woman who once redefined what royalty could be. The nation celebrated. There were gun salutes, headlines, and cheers outside the Lindo wing. But inside those hospital walls, behind the headlines, a very different story was beginning. One not about crowns or cameras, but about a little girl whose story would be written quietly in kitchens, gardens, and bedtime routines, far from flashing lights. While the world waited for the next glimpse of her royal smile, William and Kate made a different decision. They pulled back. They chose Anmer Hall, tucked into the Norfolk countryside. Not as a retreat, but as a declaration. Charlotte wouldn't grow up on a stage. She'd grow up grounded. There, surrounded by fields and far from photographers, she played in muddy boots, laughed in wide-open spaces, and followed her mother around the kitchen, tugging at aprons and tasting spoonfuls. There were no rehearsed waves, no orchestrated appearances, just moments, real ones that shaped her not as a princess, but as a person. Kate, fiercely protective, wasn't just sheltering her daughter from the press, she was giving her space to breathe, to feel, to grow. William, determined not to repeat the mistakes of his past, found in fatherhood a second chance to build what he had longed for as a child. A family unshaken by the storm outside. And Charlotte? She absorbed it all. Not through lectures or lessons, but through the gentle consistency of love. Her world was small but safe, quiet but powerful. And in that silence, her spirit began to take shape. She wasn't alone. With George as her guide, and Louis soon to follow, Charlotte was nestled in a trio of siblings bound not just by blood, but by a shared experience of growing up in a modern royal household that valued heart over heritage. They weren't just heirs and spares. They were explorers in their own backyard, mischief makers in matching pajamas, secret keepers in palace hallways. Charlotte, the middle child, absorbed both roles, protective, like an older sister, playful like the youngest. Her bond with George was solid. With Louis, it was soft. She found her place not in title, but in love. This foundation, quietly built, in moments the public would never see, gave Charlotte something few royal children have ever had. An emotional core untouched by expectation. Before she ever bowed at a royal engagement, before she ever curtsied in front of a camera, she knew who she was. Not as a royal, not as a future leader, but as a daughter, a sister, and a child whose earliest memories were painted in warmth, not headlines. But even in those quiet early years, Charlotte's spark couldn't be hidden for long. She waved, she teased, she captured cameras with just one glance. Charlotte didn't grow into the spotlight. She owned it. From the moment the EE family moved to Kensington Palace, her world shifted from quiet fields to royal courtyards, from private gardens to public platforms. But where most children might shrink under the weight of royal attention, Charlotte seemed to rise. It wasn't forced. It wasn't taught. It was instinct. Her steps onto the royal stage weren't tentative. They were steady. She didn't just appear beside her parents. She lit up the space around them. And the public? They noticed. Not because she wore a tiara or held a title, but because she radiated something real in a world that often feels manufactured. She became a favorite of the press almost overnight, not because she said anything grand, but because she didn't have to. One cheeky look during a christening, a tongue stuck out during a charity race, a playful nudge at her brothers during a photo, these weren't staged moments. They were spontaneous, unfiltered. And they cut through the polished surface of royalty like a burst of laughter in a silent room. Every time she stepped in front of a camera, there was a spark. Not a performance, but a presence. She wasn't there to be perfect. She was there to be Charlotte. And that's exactly why she stood out. At balcony appearances, while others remained stiff and formal, Charlotte danced between poise and play. During the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, she stood proud beside her great-grandmother, curtsied with grace, but never lost her edge. A subtle eye roll, a sly grin, a flicker of mischief, she brought humanity to an institution known for its silence. In an age where every frame is analyzed, every angle dissected, she didn't retreat. She engaged. And in doing so, she rewrote what it meant to be a young royal. Not bound by stiffness, not shielded by handlers, but fully present and entirely herself. The media couldn't get enough. But it wasn't about spectacle. It was about sincerity. Charlotte wasn't acting out. She was simply being honest. Her expressions told the truth. Most royals never speak. She showed when she was amused. She showed when she was annoyed. And the public embraced her because of it. She wasn't trying to break royal rules. She was just showing that behind every tradition, there's still a child with thoughts, feelings, and fire. That delicate blend of authenticity and discipline became her signature. One moment, she was curtsying with regal elegance. The next, she was sticking out her tongue to lighten the moment. And somehow, it worked. But beneath the charm was something far more powerful, a quiet strength that would soon take the world by surprise. Behind her famous sass was a young girl paying close attention, waiting for the right moment to act. Princess Charlotte may have become a media darling for her witty glances and unapologetic facial expressions, but those playful sparks weren't just charm. They were sharp glimpses into a mind that was always watching, always learning. She wasn't just reacting, she was reading the room, decoding every royal rule, every tradition, and every silent expectation placed upon her young shoulders. She didn't need anyone to explain the weight of her world. She felt it. And still, she moved through it like someone twice her age, with grace, calculation, and quiet control. One moment changed everything. It was the Queen's funeral. Millions watching. Every gesture mattered. Silence ruled. And in the middle of that pressure, it was Charlotte, not an adult, who remembered what to do. As her older brother, Prince George, stood beside her, momentarily frozen by the emotion of the day, Charlotte leaned in, not loud, not obvious, and reminded him to bow. It was quick, gentle, but firm. And that single act of guidance from the youngest, in the line, revealed something the cameras had missed for years. She wasn't just the cheeky one. She was grounded. She knew where she was, who she represented, and what it meant. This composure didn't come from instruction. It came from instinct. At Cardiff Castle, during a musical event with professional musicians and dignitaries in attendance, children were invited to try their hand at conducting an orchestra. Most hesitated. Some giggled. But Charlotte? She stepped forward, picked up the baton, and led. No nerves. No glancing for approval. She simply owned the moment. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt like she was meant to be there. Like something inside her understood the tempo of leadership, even in a room full of adults. She didn't swing wildly or act out. She observed, then acted with quiet authority. But just when the world thought they had her figured out as the polished princess in training, she reminded them that her spirit hadn't been dulled by duty. At the King's Cup sailing event, under the eyes of the press, she turned to the cameras and without hesitation stuck her tongue out. It was playful, unfiltered, entirely her. And the crowd loved it. Because it wasn't rebellious. It was real, a small rebellion against the Polish that smothers so many royal moments. But even then, there was control. She never went too far, never crossed a line. It was just enough to say, "I'm here, I see you, and I'm still me." That's what makes Charlotte so captivating. She walks the tightrope between tradition and truth without flinching. She's respectful, but not robotic. Obedient, but not silent. Her gestures, her glances, they're never for show. They're sincere. She doesn't try to look perfect. She just shows up as she is. And somehow, in the sea of royal expectation, that honesty cuts through. She balances the curiosity of childhood with the poise of a future leader. And people can feel it. But her strongest moments didn't happen on camera. They unfolded quietly, where no royal rules could hide her honesty. One private sentence spoken softly by a little girl cut through centuries of royal pressure. It didn't echo through a palace hallway or blare from the headlines. It was quiet, delicate, almost missed. But when Princess Charlotte looked up at her father, not as a prince, not as the future king, but as the man she called Dad, everything shifted. "I miss you," she said, her voice calm, steady, and painfully clear. "I miss having you as my dad." The weight of her words didn't come from their volume, but from their truth. And in that moment, nothing about royal life mattered. Not the lineage, not the protocol, not the legacy. Just one child's plea for connection, raw, unfiltered, impossible to ignore. That single sentence shattered the room's rhythm. Sandringham, once filled with laughter, holiday music, and the gentle rustling of wrapping paper, fell into a stunned stillness. Not from confusion, not even from shock, but from understanding. Charlotte had reached into the heart of a man trained to hide emotion and pulled out something real. Her innocence didn't challenge the monarchy, it disarmed it. She didn't accuse, she didn't blame, she simply revealed. And in doing so, she dismantled a wall that duty had quietly built between a father and his children. That moment wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of love. And that's what made it so powerful. Kate saw it first, not just the courage it took for Charlotte to speak, but the deeper shift it represented. This wasn't just a personal moment. It was generational. For years, royal parenting had been defined by distance, formality, and emotional reserve. But Kate had raised her children differently, with empathy, with presence, with the belief that even within a centuries-old institution, there was space for honesty. So when Charlotte spoke, Kate didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to protect or explain. She let the silence hang, let the truth land. Her eyes met her daughter's not with shock, but with pride. Not for what Charlotte had said, but for what it meant. For William, the impact was immediate. He stood motionless, the weight of the moment breaking through the polished exterior he'd spent his life perfecting. For so long, he had worn the mask of the future monarch, controlled, poised, emotionally unreachable. But Charlotte didn't speak to the prince. She spoke to the father. And in that split second, the two identities collided. The carefully managed version of William, the public figure, the polished air melted away. And in its place stood a man, a father, vulnerable, exposed, and suddenly aware of what he'd been missing. That moment didn't wound him. It woke him, too. Those inside the palace, it would later be described as a turning point, not in policy, not in structure, but in spirit. The message was never repeated. It didn't need to be. Its echo traveled in small moments, longer embraces, quieter dinners, a gentler tone in his voice. It wasn't dramatic. It was human. And in the tightly choreographed world of royalty, that made it revolutionary. What came next proved Charlotte's voice would leave ripples far beyond that one evening. One private sentence spoken softly by a little girl cut through centuries of royal pressure. It didn't echo through a palace hallway or blare from the headlines. It was quiet, delicate, almost missed. But when Princess Charlotte looked up at her father, not as a prince, not as the future king, but as the man she called Dad, everything shifted. "I miss you," she said, her voice calm, steady, and painfully clear. "I miss having you as my dad." The weight of her words didn't come from their volume, but from their truth. And in that moment, nothing about royal life mattered. Not the lineage, not the protocol, not the legacy. Just one child's plea for connection, raw, unfiltered, impossible to ignore. That single sentence shattered the room's rhythm. Sandringham, once filled with laughter, holiday music, and the gentle rustling of wrapping paper, fell into a stunned stillness. Not from confusion, not even from shock, but from understanding. Charlotte had reached into the heart of a man trained to hide emotion and pulled out something real. Her innocence didn't challenge the monarchy, it disarmed it. She didn't accuse, she didn't blame, she simply revealed. And in doing so, she dismantled a wall that duty had quietly built between a father and his children. That moment wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of love. And that's what made it so powerful. Kate saw it first, not just the courage it took for Charlotte to speak, but the deeper shift it represented. This wasn't just a personal moment. It was generational. For years, royal parenting had been defined by distance, formality, and emotional reserve. But Kate had raised her children differently, with empathy, with presence, with the belief that even within a centuries-old institution, there was space for honesty. So when Charlotte spoke, Kate didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to protect or explain. She let the silence hang, let the truth land. Her eyes met her daughter's not with shock, but with pride. Not for what Charlotte had said, but for what it meant. For William, the impact was immediate. He stood motionless, the weight of the moment breaking through the polished exterior he'd spent his life perfecting. For so long, he had worn the mask of the future monarch, controlled, poised, emotionally unreachable. But Charlotte didn't speak to the prince. She spoke to the father. And in that split second, the two identities collided. The carefully managed version of William, the public figure, the polished air melted away. And in its place stood a man, a father, vulnerable, exposed, and suddenly aware of what he'd been missing. That moment didn't wound him. It woke him, too. Those inside the palace, it would later be described as a turning point, not in policy, not in structure, but in spirit. The message was never repeated. It didn't need to be. Its echo traveled in small moments, longer embraces, quieter dinners, a gentler tone in his voice. It wasn't dramatic. It was human. And in the tightly choreographed world of royalty, that made it revolutionary. What came next proved Charlotte's voice would leave ripples far beyond that one evening. Most children grow into confidence. Charlotte was born with it, and she's teaching others how to use it wisely. In a world where every blink is dissected, every movement scrutinized, Charlotte doesn't flinch. She holds her ground, stares down the flashing lenses of photographers, and makes it clear she may be small, but she sees everything. And what she doesn't say with words, she speaks through her eyes. There's a sharpness in her glance, a quiet command in her posture. At events where most children would cling to their parents, Charlotte stands tall, her presence measured but firm. She doesn't demand the spotlight. She simply absorbs it without apology, without hesitation. There's something else, too, something deeper. She understands emotional boundaries in a way that defies her age. She knows when to speak, and perhaps more impressively, when not to. When to comfort with a look, when to observe with curiosity, and when to simply hold space for the people around her. During tense moments, she doesn't act out. She grounds herself, remains calm, composed, and still. That discipline doesn't come from training. It comes from emotional awareness. She reads people, senses their energy, and responds not with mimicry, but with insight. She's not being shaped into a leader. She's shaping what leadership could look like. And the proof is everywhere. Watch her at formal ceremonies, standing beside world leaders, towering elders, and royal veterans, unbothered, unshaken. She doesn't fade into the background, nor does she steal attention. She aligns, she adapts, she belongs, and in doing so, she challenges every outdated notion of what it means to be a young royal. This isn't just about appearances, it's about presence. When she steps into a room, there's a palpable shift. Eyes move to her, not because she's performing, but because she's steady, grounded, intentional. She knows who she is, and that unnerves even the most seasoned observers. What separates Charlotte isn't her title. It's the balance Zoe struck between reverence and realness. She follows protocol with precision, curtsies with elegance, and pays respect to the traditions handed down to her. But she never erases herself in the process. Her individuality remains intact. That is the brilliance. She doesn't rebel against the crown. She redefines its voice. In moments where she locks eyes with the press and signals them to step back, it's not a tantrum. It's a boundary. In times when she speaks, it's with intention. And when she's silent, it's with purpose. She is not just part of the next generation, she is shaping what it means to belong to it. The world no longer sees Charlotte as just the adorable royal who makes headlines with cheeky expressions. They see a girl evolving before their eyes into something rare, a future figure of influence, rooted not in status, but in authenticity. Her strength doesn't come from power. It comes from empathy, observation, and an unshakable sense of self. She didn't break royal rules, she simply reminded them what they were meant to protect. Princess Charlotte didn't storm through palace halls demanding change. She didn't make speeches or issue ultimatums. But through her quiet existence, her natural strength, and the simple fact of being born when she was, she became a symbol of something the monarchy hadn't seen in centuries: reform wrapped in grace. When she arrived on May 2nd, 2015, the world celebrated another royal child. But what most missed was that she wasn't just another child in the royal lineage. She was a first, a living emblem of a shift that had been long overdue. Because of the Perth Agreement, passed just a few years before her birth, Charlotte wasn't pushed down the line of succession when her younger brother, Prince Louis, was born. For centuries, daughters, no matter how capable or beloved, were automatically outranked by their younger brothers. But not anymore. Not for Charlotte. She retained her place as fourth in line to the throne. It wasn't a headline that screamed revolution. It was a whisper. But it echoed through time. That legal amendment didn't just give her a position. It gave her a precedent. For the first time, a royal daughter stood firm against the tide of old-world hierarchy. And she did it by simply existing. That quiet resistance matters. In a family built on unchanging protocol and centuries of tradition, Charlotte is a reminder that evolution doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives with a smile and a bow. She doesn't challenge the crown. She redefines its meaning. A monarchy once known for rigidity now watches as its youngest female heir grows into a new kind of presence, balanced, expressive, grounded. Her strength doesn't come from opposition. It comes from understanding. She carries history, but she's not bound by it. Instead, she walks alongside it, illuminating the path forward with each step. Her very name tells the story. Charlotte Elizabeth Diana. 3 names, 3 generations, 3 legacies intertwined. Charlotte, for her grandfather, the future King Charles. Elizabeth, for her great-grandmother, the longest reigning monarch in British history. And Diana, the name that still brings both ache and awe, tied forever to a woman who changed how the world viewed royalty. In one name, the past, present, and future coexist. Charlotte is the living thread that binds them, not in symbolism alone, but in action. Her grace echoes Elizabeth's discipline, her warmth, Diana's heart, and her own presence? That's something entirely new. She is not rebellious. She is transformative. She hasn't torn down the palace walls. She's walked through them, reminding everyone inside why they were built in the first place: to serve, to protect, to endure. Charlotte represents a version of royalty that doesn't ask for worship but connection. Not dominance, but dignity. And as she matures, Charlotte's legacy won't just be about what she said, but what she inspired. She may only be a child, but the future of the royal family may be resting on her quiet courage. Princess Charlotte's moment wasn't born out of grandeur or ceremony. It unfolded in silence, within walls meant to protect tradition, not challenge it. But what she stirred inside her father wasn't temporary. It was a reckoning. Since that evening at Sandringham, William has been different. Not in the royal duties he performs, but in the way he moves through them. There's a new softness in his stride, a deliberate stillness in the way he listens. A man once consumed by responsibility is now reconnected to the very reason that responsibility matters: family. And that awakening wasn't sparked by counsel or command. It came from a daughter's truth. Kate, too, felt the shift. Not just in her husband, but in herself. For years, she carried the invisible weight of raising children in a world that rarely allows them to be just that, children. She shielded, nurtured, guided. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment her daughter became the teacher. Watching Charlotte speak that night, Kate wasn't just witnessing her child's bravery, she was witnessing the validation of everything she had worked to build. A home where honesty had space to breathe. A palace where emotions weren't hidden behind protocol. A legacy that wasn't dictated by tradition, but reimagined through empathy. The public sees it too, but they're not drawn to Charlotte because of her title or her lineage. They're drawn to her because she feels real. In a family where every gesture is often rehearsed, Charlotte's spontaneity cuts through. Whether it's her fierce little glance at the paparazzi or a knowing smirk at a royal event, she's unfiltered and unafraid. She doesn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her authenticity speaks volumes. In an age where image is curated, she remains untouched, untamed by the machinery of monarchy, yet destined to influence it. That's the paradox she carries. poised enough to lead, grounded enough to connect, and so, questions begin to form. Not about whether Charlotte will ever wear a crown, but what kind of crown she might help shape for the future. Could she become a bridge between tradition and truth? Could she influence the way future monarchs parent, rule, and relate? In her small hands may lie the potential to humanize an institution that has long stood above the people it represents. Not by rejecting the past, but by breathing new meaning into it. She's not rewriting the rulebook. She's simply reminding the world why those rules were written in the first place. Princess Charlotte didn't need a crown to make history, she only needed a voice. What do you think her future holds? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe and watch the videos that are showing on your screen.